Good morning. My name is Natalie Kertes Weaver. I'm Professor of Theology and Religious Studies at Ursuline College in Pepper Pike, Ohio, and I am speaking to you today from my home office in University Heights, Ohio. I am coming to you remotely for the second part of our four-part series on examining conscience and Christian narrative because we can't meet due to the spread of the coronavirus. So I would like to wish all of you, first off, a very good morning. I hope that you are home and well, that you have everything that you need in your homes and that you can look forward to spending some time with the people that you love in your home. Maybe a little bit too much time, we'll see, but I hope that it goes quickly for you all and that everybody is safe and well, and those are my prayers and thoughts with you this morning. So I'm pleased to be here with you. Although we're using this different format, I hope I can share a couple of things for you to think about with respect to conscience and Christian narrative. And I just want to recap briefly what we talked about last week before we move into a discussion of conscience and confession. So last week we considered conscience in the Bible, and our goal was really, I think, to get at some discussion of the conscience of Jesus. Now, as I started thinking about conscience and examining it, I discovered for myself pretty quickly that conscience isn't really something that was spoken to me or spoken of to me too frequently in my own formation experiences. I have a degree in philosophy, a degree in classical languages, a degree in religion and ethics, a degree in theology. So I have this background, right? And in my experiences, I can't really recall too much overt formal discussion of conscience. Most of the discussion of conscience that has come my way has been studying what other people have said about conscience, and usually that has been eclipsed by a larger discussion of reason and the function of reason as the discerning faculty in the human person that can separate out good from bad. So, conscience is interesting because we use this word and we think we know what we mean by it. We've all had some experience of it. I asked the folks last week to consider their first sort of internal awareness of conscience, and that was an interesting exercise. I think all of you who are listening to this could do the same thing and might remember some moment in your childhood when you either did something bad or did something good or wanted to do something bad, which you didn't do, and felt that internal pull. So it's a good place to begin with our own experience, to consider this idea that conscience, it's a compound word that suggests something that is a co-science or a con-science. So the implication being that there's some extrinsic place from which this sort of innate moral knowing comes from. And the large Christian tradition is really concerned about the formation of conscience and recognizes that this is quite important and that conscience is a key anthropological experience. That is, it's essential to what it is to be a human, to have this experience of a co-knowledge with something outside of ourselves, which speaks within us, which is ours, and at the same time also something that comes from outside of ourselves. And so the Christian narrative then answers that question of, okay, so if it's from outside of oneself, whence comes it? And of course the answer is God. And so looking at the biblical stories, one can examine them to say, where's conscience in the Bible? What's going on here with conscience? And so I wanted to see what I could find about Jesus. And it was pretty clear to me when I began looking into this that there isn't really any explicit discussion of Jesus in the stories of his life in the Gospels. So that's not a problem. I don't think that the Gospel writers were imagining me when they wrote what they wrote so that they could give me material to talk to you about. So it's not a surprise that there isn't any explicit discussion of this. And indeed, it becomes obvious pretty quickly when you start probing around in this idea of what was Jesus's conscience like, that we're already just opening up this giant Christological question about what did Jesus know, how did he know it, what was his experience like, was it a divine experience, was it a human experience, and there were debates about these things for 600 years. So it's not a surprise to me that our biblical authors weren't explicitly discussing the conscience of Jesus. What they do seem to discuss, and pretty confidently, is Jesus' God consciousness. So the consciousness of Jesus, which seems to be one that is permeated with his awareness of God, his Abba. And so last week we looked at the stories of his life, from his baptism, his temptation, his life in ministry, his early childhood experience in Jerusalem, where he's in his father's temple, some material from his teachings, his events surrounding his Last Supper and arrest and crucifixion and his final words, to get into his God consciousness. And although we couldn't really confidently make too many bold claims about his conscience, that is to say, how it was functioning within him, it is very clear to me that his conscience, whatever that was, would have been profoundly informed by his God consciousness. Now, it's a little different when we look at his disciples and his followers and the people that he interacts with, because they do have conscience experiences which are engaged by their encounter with Jesus. So we examined just a couple of stories, but I think the ones that we looked at give us really interesting insights into how we can use this kind of question model to read the Bible. And looking at stories such as the story of Martha and Mary, where Mary decides, I'm going to hang out with him. I'm not going to do this thing that's expected of me. This is an act of conscience. It's a kind of willful rejection of a social norm to do what is more valuable. And so this is an interesting examination for us of how the conscience encounter with Jesus can prompt us to behave differently. And we looked at a number of such stories. So we looked at stories where there's a guilty conscience that surfaces, such as the stories of Matthew after he betrays Jesus, and of course the Judas stories in the aftermath of his betrayal, or rather Peter's denial, and Judas's betrayal. And we looked at the conscience. Another place we looked at the conscience of characters in the scripture was in the Roman officials, so Pilate and the centurion and the people around him who proclaimed Jesus truly was the Son of God, or Pilate's washing his hands. And while these stories have their own rhetorical purpose, they're sort of exonerating the Roman responsibility for the death of Jesus, they're also suggesting that in the encounter with Jesus, one can have a kind of truth-speaking conscience. And so we looked at a variety of different events, and I guess my takeaway from the materials that we looked at was that the encounter with Jesus, who is himself formed by his own God consciousness, but elicits a strong engagement of the human conscience. And then we looked at Paul's treatment of conscience, and there are explicit mentions of conscience in the Pauline letters, and the slides from last week's presentation will also be available to you soon if you don't already have them. And so you can review various places in the New Testament where you see Paul speaking specifically to this idea of conscience. And my assessment of the Pauline material is that he's really speaking to a different kind of quality of conscience than had theretofore been part of the philosophy of antiquity that considered conscience this sort of pre-philosophical innate moral knowing that condemned us. So this, most of the time when the ancients spoke of conscience outside of that early Christian context, they looked at it as something that was like, the thing that tells you you're doing something bad when you know you ought not to be acting in this way. But to me, Paul seems to be expanding this notion, evolving this notion of conscience to say this is part of the character of the community. It's part of the ontological character of the community that is transformed through Christ. And it also shows its originary nature as that which God has created. That is, within each human being, there is this innate moral knowing that God has given to us. And this is where the law lives in the heart. And so this is going to open up all sorts of relationships to the idea of covenant, and to the idea of the relationship with God, which is how folks in the later centuries are going to speak to conscience as a kind of Christian norm. So large takeaways so far from our series are, well, one, how fascinating this is as just a Christological idea, but even beyond that, how central this is as part of the study of human knowing and human formation. So it is one thing for us to teach people codes of ethics or to teach morality, to talk about moral norms, or to study various schools of thought about how you make judgments about what is right and what is wrong. It is another thing altogether to form people to be engaged with their own consciences in a thoughtful and serious and self-respecting way, and other-respecting way. I mean, really at the heart of this idea of conscience is this core human dignity, that we have this thing, this quality in us, which is a knowing and gives us the opportunity to respond, to act with courage, to act even in ways that might be contrary to our own self-good, but which are born out of our understanding of what is right. And so this leads me into this next area, which is considering stories of confession as the performance of conscience. And here I described this session in the original materials that I sent out as that which would explore the hermeneutical function of confession and testimony in the formation and enactment of Christian identity as a genre of speech. So confession plays an important part in Christian community as a way that we talk about who we are and a way that we form ourselves as a community. And so I said we would look at some of the great confession stories of figures like St. Paul or St. Agustin, to the personal testimonies that we give in our own community. So there's a sort of range of thinking about confession speech, and to consider its value in encouraging, giving witness, confirming our own faith when we hear it in others, bringing about like a depth of conviction because someone's giving witness to this. And so, in general, to draw our attention to the self-storying speech that helps us form our identities. The self-storying speech that helps us form our identities. When we tell who we are, what we think about ourselves, this helps to shape, this shapes us, right? And I think this is really an important moment, an interesting moment for us to be having this conversation. As we sit here on the precipice of what's probably some kind of quarantine that's going to last for a little while, I've been figuring out for myself, how do I prepare my kids? I've got 2 kids, right? How do I prepare for this with them? And the playful part of me is excited to be home with my children, but a bigger part of me looks at this as an opportunity to talk with them about the things that matter. And how do I talk about things that matter? Well, part of it is through telling stories. So I immediately think with my youngest child that what I'm going to do is talk about Bible stories. Now, why choose the Bible stories? And I think it's because they're stories of love. Now, there's all sorts of large meta-narratives that people can see that would guide our reading of the Bible, but I think those stories are there because they give witness to a human community's relationship with God, and that experience was valuable enough to share first orally, to build a community around, like the story of Exodus, right? It's a story that forms an identity of a people. The idea of covenant is told over and over again, and even the ritual and calendar repetition of memorializing and revisiting events in history, they're the formation of the community through narrative. And there's no purpose for those stories to be there except that they are communicating the identity of the people as a people who understands itself to be loved by God. I find this to be comfort because it is an overarching story of comforting love in spite of anything that might happen. I immediately think of Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning when I think about this idea of love being the meaning. And so it's an interesting way back into scripture, but I just want to share Viktor Frankl on this because it's so poignant and such a critical way of thinking about how he tells a story and what the story is about, and that this is the story. And to me, it's the story of scripture. So he says, in spite of all of the enforced physical and mental primitiveness of the life in a concentration camp, it was possible for spiritual life to deepen. Sensitive people who were used to a rich intellectual life may have suffered much pain, but the damage to their inner selves was less. They were able to retreat from their terrible surroundings to a life of inner riches and spiritual freedom. Only in this way can one explain the apparent paradox that some prisoners of a less hardy makeup often seem to survive camp life better than did those of a robust nature. In order to make myself clear, I'm forced to fall back on personal experience. So here he tells this story. Let me tell what happened on those early mornings when we were to march to our work site. There were shouted commands: detachment, forward, march, left 2, 3, 4, left 2, 3, 4. First man about, left and left and left and left, caps off. These words sound in my ears even now. And at the order caps off, we passed the gate of the camp and searchlights were trained upon us. Whoever did not march smartly got a kick. And worse off was the man who, because of the cold, had pulled his cap back over his ears before permission was given. We stumbled on in the darkness over big stones and through large puddles, along the lone road leading us to the camp. The accompanying guards kept shouting at us and driving us with the butts of their rifles, and anyone with very sore feet supported himself on his neighbor's arm. Hardly a word was spoken. The icy wind did not encourage talk, and hiding his mouth behind his upturned collar, the man marching next to me whispered suddenly, "If our wives could see us now, I do hope they are better off in their camps and don't know what's happening to us." That brought thoughts of my own wife to mind, and as we stumbled on for miles, slipping on icy spots, supporting each other time and again, dragging one another up and onward, nothing was said. But we both knew. Each of us was thinking of his wife. Occasionally, I looked at the sky where the stars were fading and the pink light of the morning was beginning to spread behind a dark bank of clouds. But my mind clung to my wife's image. Imagining it with an uncanny acuteness, I heard her answering me, saw her smile, her frank and encouraging look. Real or not, her look was then more luminous than the sun which was beginning to rise. A thought transfixed me. For the first time in my life, I saw the truth as it is set into song by so many poets, proclaimed as the final wisdom by so many thinkers. Truth. This truth that love is the ultimate and the highest goal to which man can aspire. Then I grasped the meaning of the greatest secret that human poetry and human thought and belief have to impart. The salvation of man is through love and in love. I understood how a man who has nothing left in this world still may know bliss, be it only for a brief moment in the contemplation of his beloved, in a position of utter desolation, when man cannot express himself in positive action, when his only achievement may consist in enduring his sufferings in the right way, in an honorable way. In such a position, man can, through loving contemplation of the image he carries of his beloved, achieve fulfillment. For the first time in my life, I was able to understand the meaning of the words, "The angels are lost in perpetual contemplation of an infinite glory." In front of me, a man stumbled, and those following fell upon him. The guard rushed over and used his whip on them all. Thus my thoughts were interrupted for a few minutes, but soon my soul found its way back from the prisoner's existence to another world, and I resumed to talk with my loved one. I asked her questions, and she answered. She questioned me in return, and I answered. Stop! We had arrived at our worksite. Everybody rushed into the dark hut in the hope of getting a fairly decent tool. Each prisoner got a spade or a pickaxe. Can't you hurry up, you pigs? Soon we had resumed the previous day's positions in the ditch, and the frozen ground cracked under the point of the pickaxes and sparks flew. The men were silent, their brains numb, but my mind still clung to the image of my wife. A thought crossed my mind. I didn't even know if she were still alive. I only knew one thing, which I have learned well by now. Love goes very far beyond the physical person of the beloved. It finds its deepest meaning in his spiritual being, his inner self. Whether or not he is actually present, whether or not he is still alive at all, ceases somehow to be of importance. I did not know whether my wife was alive. I had no means of finding out. But at the moment, it ceased to matter. There was no need for me to know. Nothing could touch the strength of my love. My thoughts and the image of my beloved, had I known that my wife was dead, I think that I would still have given myself undisturbed by that knowledge to the contemplation of her image, and that my mental conversation with her would have been just as vivid and just as satisfying. Set me like a seal upon thy heart, for love is as strong as death. So that's Viktor Frankl describing his experiences in the concentration camp. And it's story that tells truth. It's story that forms. It's story that convicts. It's confession. It's testimony. It's witness. So this is what I think the Bible authors were doing. This is what I think that those Hebrew writers who crafted the story of Israel during its long journey to Canaan, through its history, through its struggles, in its time of exile, in its efforts at restoration, and in its hope for fulfillment. They were driven by this love. And in the Christian scripture authors found a fulfillment of this promise, which they wrote about, which transformed their way of being, their community, their sense of their own conscience. Now they had an answer to that. And these stories are the stories that are critical in forming who we are. With my older son, as we look at these very frightening times and scary times, the materials that I have invited him to read with me are of a similar nature, but are directly addressing the problem of theodicy. So they're asking, who is God in light of the suffering of the world, and approaching this from an explicit philosophical and theological dialogue. And our opportunity to read these things together and to examine these stories together is absolutely at the heart of who we are. I think about the potential risks that people face in these times, and the thing that distinguishes us from, being unkind to one another and unsupportive of one another and fearful of one another and protective of ourselves to the exclusion of others and so on, is the character that we hold, that is formed by the values that we ascribe to, which are formed by the stories that we tell. And the community does this every week when it reads the stories of Scripture. It does this every week when it reenacts those stories, when it speaks out of its homily. And we will be talking next week about the larger narrative of the community. But it's an important thing for us to understand that what we are actually doing is embodying story. And so this is a type of speech. And this confessional speech is I don't want to say unique to the Christian experience, but it's essential to it. So, in the second part of my talk this morning, we're going to turn to an examination of confession. Hi, welcome back. As we continue our conversation around confession and testimony and the performance of conscience, I thought I would share a couple of words about my own testimony. Not because I think it's so important, but because I recognize how important it is in the way that I talk about Christianity, which is really my point. So, there are a couple places where I consider myself to have been deeply formed in myself, and which is how I would tell my story if someone were asking me, sort of, how did you become who you are, or how did you end up with these faith ideas, or whatever. And what's very interesting about this to me is that my story really does not begin with myself. It begins with my grandmother on my mom's side. So my maternal grandmother is a woman named Bertha Lee Sigmund. That was her name, her maiden name. She married Samuel Lawrence, who was my grandfather, when she was quite young, and survived him. And then she married another gentleman named Louis Morehouse and survived him as well. My grandmother passed away 21 years ago on the 10th of March. So I have had a few decades without her, but she was still one of the most important, influential people in my life. My grandma had, I think, maybe a 6th grade education, and yet she was extremely knowing about many, many things, very capable, very competent in her ability to take care of her family. She reared her children independently. Though there was a man involved, she was really the caregiver and the provider to them. She lived in a rural part of Virginia with, I believe, 4 of her children before my mother was born, who was the youngest of her children. And my grandmother gave birth to 6 children. 4 survived until adulthood. And she was not a Christian when she started out. She didn't have any training or anything like that. But what she did have was a child that died. So she had a little boy named Raymond who passed away when he was about 9 years old. And there's a picture of Raymond that hangs now in my mother's home, but which hung in her home all the years that I knew her. And he was beautiful. His big green eyes and dark hair. He was a lovely, lovely young child, and he was purportedly very sweet and angelic in his demeanor and so on. But he fell victim to a snake bite, and so the venom killed him. And this tragedy marked my grandmother so deeply that I still feel it in as almost my own. I visited where my grandmother lived right after 9/11 with my mom. And we wanted to go actually find the little graveyard where Raymond was buried. And there was a gentleman there who took us to the graveyard, and he remembered the passing of Raymond, and he described how it devastated that community and how it devastated my grandmother. So it was an interesting independent attestation to hear this guy, David Toller, talking about Raymond from so many years before. Raymond had passed before my mother was even born, so my mom never knew Raymond, but she knew my grandmother's grief and carried it very much, and it was in part because of, or probably mostly because of, this loss that my grandmother was so attracted to the idea of a Christian resurrection when she first learned about it. And she became deeply convicted on the hope that she would be restored to this child that she lost, and that her family would be whole again, and that there would be really no loss. And she was devout in this, so it was my grandmother's hope in ultimately a resurrection and a recreation of this earth that led her to be a devout follower of the Seventh-day Adventist belief and an ardent preparer for the second coming of Christ. And so she she went around door to door. She did these things and helped to found a little school where my mom went as a child. This was the core of my family's religious faith. And it was ardent enough in my grandmother that she made it possible for my mom to go to a Seventh-day Adventist boarding school. And so this was a very big part of my mother's life, and therefore it was a big part of my life. Now, that didn't last for that long. When, in my early childhood, there was a divorce and a remarriage, and my stepfather and my mother did not together go to the church, so we sort of quit going. But I carried with me, nevertheless, this sort of fervor that seemed to course through their line. And the other place where I really felt it, it was not in what we called Sabbath school, where we did our little Bible studies or anything like that. My mom was the organist for the church, and I would sit with her in the front, and we had to be very good. I mean, you're pretty good in the Seventh-day Adventist church anyway. You don't really move around a lot. You don't talk. You don't clap. You're just kind of quiet. But we had to be very good because we were up front with my mom, because she would have to keep getting up and coming back to play the organ. And so she would pet me. She would tickle my back or stroke me and cuddle up with me while we listened to these really, really, really long sermons. And church lasted a long time. And it was that experience of feeling her hand sort of on my back or on my head, or her comforting arm around me, the abundant sense of love and the abundant sense of safety next to her, that really became the tactile and concrete church for me. And it was all informed by some form of a Christian doctrine. And I carried that, and it was quite autonomous. That is, the way that my mother practiced her Christianity and lived out this hope, in part her mother's hope for a reunion with all of her family, including this lost child. It was a manner that my mother lived this out, which was very independent. And for a church that could be quite doctrinally driven, she was not particularly swayed by that. And so I watched this combination of both conviction and sort of autonomy and independence with it, coupled with a certain sort of authority in the performance of the music, and that translated more than anything into just loving care of me, that became the foundation of my own Christian faith. Now, as a thinker, it wasn't sufficient. I challenged those ideas even from my earliest years, for whatever the reason, and that was part of who I am, and therefore began to read very copiously texts of theology and religion, even in my childhood, before I started doing it more formally in college and such. I remember in my high school anatomy class, I had some text of theology, and I was reading it during class in between like my lab assignments or something like that. And my teacher came over and saw what I was doing, and he just sort of shook his head, went about his business. But then I went on to my own advanced journey. But another important part of that for me was that I wasn't baptized as a child. The Seventh-day Adventists don't baptize children. And I felt myself very much at one point compelled to be baptized. And so I suppose rather than thinking to seek it out in some more formal way, I decided to baptize myself. Now, this is a funny thing for me because it became almost this thing I was sort of ashamed of, or I hid. I was eventually baptized through the rite of Christian initiation of adults in the Roman Catholic Church. But this private experience that I had was something that I felt to be quite true and important, but also something that I had to kind of keep secret. So it's no longer a secret. But it hasn't been for a little while. I have shared it with others. But this idea of, these crucial moments become part of the the way that we understand ourselves and understand our faith and encounter and engage with our faith. And so all of my faithfulness, whatever that is, whatever I bring to that, is forged out of this string of stories. And I also imagine that I have shaped those stories in my own mind in a didactic way, so that when I tell how I baptized myself, or when I tell something about my mother's love for me in church, I now have a lens that I use to see those stories through. That is a pair of glasses that I put on, which is rhetorically valuable in the way that I tell the story and the purpose for which I'm telling it. So when I would share that story, as I am doing now, I am offering it more as an example than anything else. But for many, that could be a kind of story that they would offer as a powerful statement of conviction, that I did this thing because I was so driven by the love of the Lord, or some such thing like that. And so it's extraordinary. It's a little bit unusual for someone to do that. And by extraordinary, I mean it's out of the daily ordinary. And so it has a sort of power of spirit attached to it, a kind of fervor with it. And then that has a value in terms of how it plays for the listener or the hearer. So all of that is what we would call a rhetoric, that it has a kind of intentional volume and purpose. And so when we share our stories, we're doing so to communicate certain elements. And it's a different type of speech than it would be if I were talking about what I did at the store, or if I were speaking to my tax person about my business expenses this year or something like that. So it's intended to communicate from a place of conviction, a kind of authority, something that is persuasive, something that can confirm something in someone else, even perhaps something that has greater truth to it because it speaks from a place of otherness. So the stories of confession that I referenced, and there are so many of them. I mean, these are just a couple that we could pull out and that are important, and therefore they're worthy of speaking about, but they're all over the Christian literature. Would be like stories of St. Paul or St. Augustine. So Paul, of course, has a dramatic conversion, and part of what makes him authoritative is he speaks that I used to be this way, and now I am this way, and the difference is so great that it could not be but for an act of the divine, and therefore there's authority to it. And so identifying the nature of the conversion in the confession that is told is what gives credibility to the life event. Something similar happens with the great Confessions of St. Augustine. Now, this is a work that has some different moments in it. It's a little bit more symphony than song, so it has a couple of different beats, and it changes up at various points. And so scholars have some varied opinions about what it's actually doing, like what is the genre of this work. But St. Augustine, who lived in the late 4th century, the late 300s and the beginning of the 400s, lived through the sack of Rome. This individual wrote this work among many, many, many others, perhaps, and this is sort of my opinion on it, as a kind of polemical work against this guy Pelagius, who was arguing something about the freedom of the will to engage God, or to seek after God, to take that first step to God, which St. Augustine said, no, we are completely dependent upon God to do this thing, and this is why we have the crucifixion. And so this work may well be a work that is purposed to say to someone like Pelagius, look, God only acts this way, like in us. We can't do it. And I'm going to tell you why I know that. And the reason I know that is I spent my whole life kind of screwing up. I had bad relationships with women. I had wrong values. I had wrong ideas. I had bad philosophy. I didn't I had wrong worldly aspirations. I was interested in entertainments. I stole things when I was a kid. I mean, he goes through everything. His sexual exploits, his, any exuberance of youth, whatever he can find in himself to say, look, this was broken in me. And there is no way that I, of my own accord, could have come to God. He did it. God did this. And so this great work is really a theological examination of the freedom of the will. It's given its value because it is spoken from the perspective of the confessor. That is one who is able to say, this thing is how I was, and this thing is how I am. And therein is the difference that makes the difference, because that is the work of God. So when we speak in this way, we are performing our conscience. We are demonstrating it. We are electing to use story in a way that is performative to communicate to an audience, perhaps an audience of one, perhaps an audience of thousands, but it has this performative element. But it's also a formation experience, and it also continues to form. And so in my visual text copy, you'll notice that I've hyphenated the Per-Formance to separate those two parts out so that we can see that it's the formation through this event, this narrative event, which is also how we come to understand ourselves. And the more often we repeat it, the more concretized becomes the narrative and the way that we think about it and who we are in relationship to it. So the other thing I want to just bring to your attention is that what we also are doing here is relying upon an interpretive process that is attached to our reading and attached to our speaking. And we use a fancy word in philosophy and theology to describe this, and I'm sure you have encountered it in various places in your worship services and your homilies and so on, but the word is hermeneutics. And hermeneutics is about interpretation, but it's also about the self-awareness of the interpreter. So when I read something and I am cognizant of my own interpretive process, I have a kind of hermeneutical awareness. When I am attentive to what I don't already know here, what's novel to me, what I may take totally for granted, my prior background, my dispositions, my prejudices, maybe a bad experience I've had with something similar, which is going to form how I think or and such. This is a hermeneutical sensitivity. And so confessing and speaking in this way is more valuable to me, I think, when we are cognizant of ourselves as speakers and interpreters or listeners to other people's stories, when we are attentive to the cues in those stories about, where we're supposed to get the point that this is what matters and this is what happened. When I pay attention to that and I don't just take it completely for granted, but I sort of dissect it a little bit so that I am really hearing what they're saying, and I'm really then critically mindful of the points that I'm supposed to get, and I can be aware of the before and after components and such. This makes me a far more acute reader of confession and testimony, so that I know why this person is saying this to me, or why I am saying it, what I'm assuming they want me to get out of the story, or what I am intending to offer in the story. As we become thoughtful and mindful about this performative piece of storytelling, I think we can be more responsible with it. Because our stories are sometimes self-affirming, sometimes they're told for the good of the community, but sometimes they need greater examining. And I think this is particularly true when we look at the collective story of the community. It is easy for us, because we repeat, as I was saying earlier in part one, when I referenced the story of the Exodus, it is easy to tell a story so often and so frequently that we lose attention to the nuances, or we read it without really reading it. I have this experience sometimes with the undergraduate students that I teach Bible to. And when we start to read these passages and stories in Scripture, sometimes they're really surprised because it's quite violent some of the time, and they are totally shocked by what they're hearing. And, well, I never heard that before. I never knew this was in the Bible. And even though we might hear it, we don't really hear it because we aren't really attentive to it. And so one of our opportunities to be better storytellers and better stewards of these narratives, which are bequeathed to us, which we embody, which we perform ritually over and over again, which we talk about, and which go on to inform who we are, who we actually are in the world, how I function in a time of crisis with my children in a quarantine situation, right? Like, this, I am who I am in part because of these stories. And so being mindful of what those stories actually are, what they're intended to be telling me, and how I choose to repeat them or to innovate upon them or to inhabit them, is the difference between being a person who is merely responsive to a tradition, in the manner of letting it just sort of be and I kind of am with it, or a person who is engaged in a way that is engaging my conscience. And so here we come back to conscience, and it's a marvelous opportunity for us to think about how story forms our conscience and how we can be conscientious speakers of story, rhetoricians of story. This is important for us individually, but it's particularly important when we start to consider conscience in the context of a public situation or a community. In our sessions in weeks 3 and 4, this is where we turn. So in week 3, we're talking about conscience and conflict in Christian character. And what I want to examine there, and so you can start to think about this, is that the community's story is advanced when there's challenge. Not necessarily when everything is going well and we're just kind of sailing on, easy breezy, beautiful cover girl days, but when there's something difficult that we have to confront. And that crisis context or contrast experience is the moment when there is an expression or the experience of a dialectic of conscience in relationship to a situation. And it is in those contexts where the community can respond in an ongoing formative and reformative manner to make the community's story relevant and just. And then in the final session, we're going to be talking about Christian story and the public conscience. And so here we've got a big, big task, but it's to consider whether or not the story is socially responsible and how it advances our own mandate to socially responsible living. So that's what we've got coming. We've got a couple weeks left to do these things. In the meanwhile, I want to invite any of you who are listening to this talk to be in touch with me. I know it's a little different since we're not face-to-face, but I am virtually available. So if you have any questions, since I can't take them in person, if you would like to forward them to me, either at my email, which is nweaver, Nweaver, at Ursuline, ursuline.edu, or through your parish staff, I will do my very best to respond to you, and I will give you my responses if I get any interesting questions from you, or even, I don't want to say that any questions would not be interesting, but I will try to respond to your questions or comments in the weeks to come. So thank you so much. God bless you. I hope you are well, that you stay well, and I look forward to seeing you next week.